is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Jerry McDermott. And I probably just can hardly tell you how many times Joanne Magnuson has sent me an email this year saying, here's another article by Jerry McDermott. Here's a response by Jerry McDermott. You need to see this. So I've been reading a lot of these articles from Dr. McDermott, and I also had the chance to meet him for the first time this morning. We had a delightful breakfast, and I found, boy, here's somebody I feel so comfortable with. And he had me at this point when he said to me this morning, Dan Ritchie is my friend. And that's all I need to know, because the friend of Dan Ritchie is my friend. And Dr. McDermott, like Dan Ritchie, is a Jonathan Edwards scholar and teaches about Jonathan Edwards. And it just gives you some sense of the breadth of his scholarship. He's also an Anglican priest, serves as the Anglican chair of divinity at Sanford University's Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama. He's written, and he's writing, and there's some stuff just about to be published. And we can hardly wait to see these books that are coming out. The New Christian Zionism, Fresh Perspectives on Israel and the Land, and Israel Matters. So we've just heard that Jesus is the Jewish theologian, and now let's hear from Dr. McDermott about, well, what went wrong? How did we lose that? Would you welcome Dr. Jerry McDermott?
Thank you, Pastor Dave. And Joanne Magnuson for thinking up this conference. And it is an honor for me to speak with Dexter Van Zyl and Dr. Tricia Miller and Dr. Young, whom we've just heard, tell us so beautifully in just 25 minutes the Jewishness of Jesus. Jesus, the Jewish theologian. Now, my topic is how Christians lost the Jewish Jesus. Now, Christians, through the end of the first century and a little bit beyond the first century, knew the Jewish Jesus. Most Christians were Jews in that period. It was beginning to open up to Gentiles, of course, as we see in Acts and in the letters of Paul. But it wasn't until about 135 AD that Christians started to lose the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, why did they, and how did they? First of all, there was a logical misstep that was taken. So the first thing that went wrong was logic. They thought like this, that the Old Testament is all about the particular. That is God, the God of Israel, coming to a particular people in a particular land and showing them who he was. And Jesus came to universalize the particular. And so the logic went, the Old Testament is the particular, the New Testament is the universal. And in the New Testament, the particular drops out. Jesus was extending the boundaries of the kingdom, they started to think in the 2nd century, to the whole earth. And they typically would quote, they began to quote in the 2nd century, Matthew 5:6, where the Beatitude, where Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." And I will explain to you at the very end of this talk, it was probably a wrong translation. And almost all of our English Bibles translated that way. It should have been, they will inherit the land. And I'll explain why at the end of this talk. So the first problem was logic. They thought that Jesus came to extend the kingdom, to take the particular and make it universal. Now, Jesus did do that. But the particular never dropped out. And I'll just say briefly, the argument in this new book that's coming out in about a month, that's called The New Christian Zionism, is made principally by New Testament scholars, arguing that the New Testament is Zionist. And the reason why we have never seen that the New Testament is Zionist is because we've been trained not to see it. And what I'm going to share with you in the next 20 minutes is how we've been trained not to see the Zionism that is from the beginning to the end of the New Testament. So after the mistaken logic, where they thought the particular dropped out of the universal in the New Testament, second, mistaken understanding of the covenant. Basically, the Jews broke the covenant, and therefore the covenant was taken away from them. This is called replacement theology, that God replaced the Jews as the holders of the covenant with the followers of the Jewish Messiah, who were eventually, almost universally, Gentiles. So the Gentiles replaced the Jews as the holders of the covenant. And one of the passages, one of the parables, Dr. Young was just telling us about a parable, one of the parables that was used was the parable in Matthew 21 of the owner of the vineyard who leased it out to tenants, went to another country. When the harvest came, he sent slaves to collect the produce, but the tenants killed one of the slaves, beat another one, and stoned the other one. So the owner of the vineyard sent a second group of slaves, and they treated that second group the same way, beating and killing. And then he said, well, I'll send my son. And the owner sent the son, and they killed the son. And then Jesus, the teller of this parable, says, the owner is going to come, and he's going to lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him produce. And whereas the other tenants were Jews, Gentile Christians starting in the 2nd century started to interpret those other tenants to be Gentile Christians. He's going to transfer the covenant from the Jews to the Gentiles. And they also used Galatians 3:28. In Christ, there is neither male nor female, Jew or Greek. And they said, you see, Jewishness is no longer important for Paul. So, therefore, it doesn't matter anymore if you're a Jew. All that matters is whether you believe in the Jewish Messiah. And of course, they after a few centuries, Christos lost its connection with Jewishness because it was simply translated Christ. And in English, we have that problem. It's translated Christ. Well, what does Christ mean? Most Christians don't know. They don't know this is the Greek translation of Meshiach, of the Anointed One, the Jewish Messiah. Christ means Messiah. So in 135, what happened in 135, can you still hear me? Yeah. Was the second Jewish revolt of Shimon bar Kokhba. The Romans were furious that these Jews are revolting a second time after the first Jewish revolt of 66 to 70. And so they changed the name of Judea to the name of the Jews' legendary most hated enemies, the Philistines. And they called it Philistina, or Palestina, comes into English as Palestine. And they drove the Jews out of Jerusalem. So at this point, for the first time, it becomes dangerous to be a Jew. Previously, the Jews had privileges in the Roman Empire. So Christians who had been identifying themselves as Jews, but a different sort of Jew, were now tempted, and most of them yielded to the temptation, to hide their Jewish identity, even though a lot of them were Jews, since being Jewish was no longer a privileged status. And now more and more Gentiles were entering into the church, and they were becoming leaders, and they lost touch, starting in the 2nd century after 135 AD, with the Jewish roots of their faith. And so you have Justin Martyr in the first half of the second century. Justin Martyr, born about 100, died, we're pretty sure, in 165 AD in Rome. He was a martyr to the Romans. He was the first to call the church the true Israel, which suggested that Jesus came to start a new religion and that Jesus had come to abandon the Judaism in which he'd been raised. Most Christians in the world today think that. Totally untrue, which we hope to convince you of by tomorrow night about this time. And so, if the church is the new Israel, is the true Israel, then it's no longer necessary to understand Judaism in order to understand Jesus. So, the Old Testament, Torah, and the whole Old Testament, Tanakh, are not important anymore. We really don't have to read them in order to understand Jesus. No, what's important for Justin Martyr is the Logos. And that's the Greek word for reason. It's a Stoic word. It's for the principle of reason throughout the cosmos. This is a Gentile concept. It's a Greek concept. And Justin said the Logos is in every culture. It was in the Jewish culture, but also the Greek culture. So the Jews had their prophets, but so did the Greeks have their prophets who spoke the meaning of the Logos. And the Greeks, made a big distinction between what is spirit and what is matter. And what is matter is bad. Plato famously said that the body is the prison of the soul. Well, prison is a negative word. Body is material. Things that are material are not really spiritual. It's only the non-material that's truly good and truly spiritual. Justin was educated in Greek philosophy. Well, then he applied it to the relationship between Israel and the church. Old Israel, Jewish Israel, is physical and temporary. But the church, the new Israel, is spiritual and permanent. Then we had Irenaeus. And by the way, the idea here that Justin starts, it's actually started with Barnabas at the end of the first century, but Justin is the one who really gives it traction. The idea that the church now has superseded Israel as the owner of the covenant. This is what supersessionism means. The church superseding Israel. So in the second half of the second century, we have Irenaeus, another church father. Now these were great church fathers, nevertheless, who did teach a lot of truth, but they also taught this error that put the church, the Christian church, on a terrible path towards centuries and centuries and centuries of persecuting and murdering Jews. So Irenaeus, in the second half of the second century, his dates are 145 to 202. He was the first, you could say, Christian philosopher of history. And he talked about different stages in the history of humanity. And Judaism, he said, was only one stage. And he suggested that you don't have to understand Israel in order to understand the history of salvation, because the really important thing is that Adam was created and Adam fell. And then the next really important thing was the second Adam, Jesus Christ, who undid what the first Adam did. And what came between, which was the history of Jews, the history of Israel, is largely only good for a negative example. How not to live, how not to believe. And then the next figure that's important in the history of getting rid of the Jewish Jesus, of forgetting the Jewish Jesus and undoing the Jewishness of Jesus, is John Chrysostom. Now, John Chrysostom was a great church father in many ways. He was a gifted orator. That's the meaning of his word. Chrysos is golden, and stomos is tongue. He is John the Golden Tongue. But at this time, and he was in basically the second half of the 4th century, 349 to 407, there was competition still between the synagogue and the church. Many Gentiles were attracted to the synagogue, as they had been all along. Even in the time of Jesus and Paul, thousands and thousands and thousands of Gentiles were going every Saturday morning to synagogue because they saw the beauty of the Jewish liturgy. They recognized immediately the superiority of this Jewish religion of the God of Israel to all the gods and religions of Greece and Rome. And even in the second half of the 4th century, there still were many, many Gentiles who were joining the synagogue. And so John Chrysostom was angry. And so he said in some of his sermons that Jews murder their own children and offer them as sacrifices. And in one sermon he said, "I hate Jews." And sadly, John Chrysostom was hugely influential on the Christian Gentile mind, further moving Christians not to want to know anything about Judaism and not to think of Jesus as a Jew. And then the great, great theologian, one of the greatest, if not the greatest theologian in the history of Christian thought, was St. Augustine. Now, Augustine was phenomenal in so many ways. And actually, we have to hand it to him that he did sort of whisper, that is, as a minor note, say, that, Israel is a word that we really should leave for Jews and their people. But, unfortunately, he taught more loudly, sort of in a major key as opposed to a minor key, that the church is the new Israel. And since Augustine became the theologian of the Middle Ages, and also a huge influence on Martin Luther, after all, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Luther learned his theology of grace, you Presbyterians, and therefore John Calvin learned his theology of grace essentially from Augustine. But because he said the church is the new Israel, and because he said the millennium is already taking place through the rule of Christ in the church, and there will be no physical, literal millennium in the future, thought the way the church began to interpret all the prophecies of the Old Testament about Israel was figuratively rather than literally, and started to apply all the prophecies about Israel in the Old Testament to the church rather than to the Jews. So then came Martin Luther at the end of the Middle Ages, the 16th century, and at first, in the first half of his career, he was actually positive toward Jews. He preached and published a famous sermon titled, "Jesus Christ Was Born a Jew." But then in his old age, unlike me who's getting older, like me who's getting older, he became cranky. And especially toward the Jews. And he started writing that the Jews broke the covenant, so it's okay to burn their synagogues. John Calvin, the great father of the Reformed tradition, basically agreed with Luther on that. Not that Jewish synagogues should be burned, and he never taught that, but he did teach that the Jewish covenant, and I'm quoting from the Institutes, the Jewish covenant deserves to be repudiated since the Jews broke the covenant, and the church is the new Israel. And ethnic Israel in the Old Testament represents bad Israel, and the church is the good new Israel. And of course, this is the basic structure of Reformed theology ever since. Then came the deists in the 18th century, and they first raised what's called the scandal of particularity, that it's unfair that God came to only a particular people named Israel and revealed himself at a particular time in history. In the Jewish religion, they said, now the deists were at the end of the 17th and beginning of the 18th centuries, and they said the Jewish religion is evil and it's irrational. They had a huge influence upon Immanuel Kant, and then later upon Friedrich Schleiermacher, the father of liberal theology, who was Reformed. And Kant, of course, was the father of modern philosophy. It's no surprise that modern philosophy has been very anti-Jewish, and particularly German philosophy and German theology. So Friedrich Schleiermacher, 18th century, the father of liberal theology, said the Old Testament lacks the Christian spirit. And no doctrine that is based primarily on the Old Testament should ever be taught as Christian. And he said it wouldn't be a bad idea if the Old Testament were gradually retired from Christian worship on Sunday morning. And it's no surprise, now Schleiermacher was German, it's no surprise that there was a church on planet Earth that made a ruling. No more should we have any readings from the Old Testament on Sunday morning. You know what that church was? A national church? The German Christian churches of the 1930s. And you know what? There are some churches in this country, many churches in the country that functionally now are doing the same thing. You never hear a sermon in the Old Testament, and rarely even readings from the Old Testament. And you know what? The Old Testament, Tanakh, is 3/4 of our Bible. 3/4. After the Holocaust, Christian theologians woke up and they scratched their head and they said, how could this have happened in the most Christianized country in human history, Germany? W.D. Davies, a great scholar, said, now we see, and why didn't we ever see before, that Paul, the Apostle Paul, never calls the church the New Israel or Jews the Old Israel. Now another great New Testament scholar, C.E.B. Cranfield, after the Holocaust in the 1950s, says, now we should realize that Romans 9-11 forbids the church to call itself the New Israel. Romans 9-11 teaches us, explicitly tells us, that God's covenant with Israel is still in place. And the new tenants in the Matthew 21 parable are faithful Jews. They're not Gentiles, they're faithful Jews. And other scholars started to say, Matthew 5:6, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the gay. That's the Greek word. That's a direct translation of Psalm 37:11. Where the word Eretz is used, and Eretz there clearly means the land of Israel. They shall inherit the land of Israel. Guess what? 4 other times in that same Psalm 37, the same phrase is used. They will inherit the land. And it's always Eretz, it always means the land of Israel. We have suffered with false translations in almost every English Bible. And it's taken away from us the Jewishness of the promise. Maybe we should, so theologians, after World War II and after the Holocaust, started to say, we need to rethink what we now see to be false, supersessionism, that the church has superseded Israel, and that God's covenant with the Jews is over. No, we need to rethink what this means. What does this mean? That God's covenant with Israel, with physical Israel, with ethnic Israel, is still in place. So Protestant Catholic theologians have been falling all over themselves the last 40 years, reaffirming that the covenant with the Jews is still in place. But what they've been ignoring is the land of Israel. And what they've been ignoring, and we'll talk about it later in the next 24 hours, is that there's plenty in the New Testament that the people of Israel and the land of Israel, the specific land of Israel, have a future in the history of God's redemption. Thank you.
I just want to say how glad I am that Gloria Weiss preached out of Jeremiah this past Sunday. And that this Sunday I'll be preaching on the book of Judges. We have just a few minutes left allotted in Dr. McDermott's time, and so if you want to ask a question, I know he'll be glad to try to answer.
Could you kindly go over the separation between the Palestinians now and the Jewish people on the land issue?
What do you mean separation?
Well, the big debate over who owns the land.
Oh, I'll talk about that tomorrow. My talk is called "What About the Palestinians?"
Can you talk a little bit about the role supersessionism plays in Islam? And I know that's not part of it. I'm ceding the ground for my talk.
Yeah, Dexter asked about the role that supersessionism plays in Islam. Pardon? Yes, the Muslims believe the Bible is the Word of God, but like Mormons, who say the same thing, they both religious communities believe that the Bible's been corrupted. The Old Testament's been corrupted, and the New Testament's been corrupted. So Muslims believe that where the text now says that when God came to Abraham, I'm going to pass down the covenant to your son Isaac, that Jews that the word there originally was not Isaac but Esau, and Jews scratched out the word Esau and wrote in Isaac. So that's one way in which they say the covenant that should have been passed on to the Arab peoples through Esau was superseded by the Jews, and they would say corruptly and illegitimately. And then, of course, they also say the Jews corrupted the Old Testament text to say that God chose Israel as his favorite nation, and really the original Old Testament text. And how do we know it's the original? Because that's what it says in the Quran. And since the Quran is the pure word of God, therefore it shows us what the Old Testament originally said before the Jews corrupted it. So what it originally said is, I don't have a favorite nation really, that every nation that accepts me, Allah, is my favorite nation. And so, but since the Jews corrupted, and since the Christians corrupted the New Testament, God had to send a new prophet who would bring the corrections and bring them the true revelation, and thus the Quran. A lady back there.
I'm curious about when Christian practice separated itself from Jewish practice. So the early Christians that were also Jews, did they keep kosher and celebrate the Jewish holidays and have Jewish rituals, including circumcision, and have a canopy over, during marriage, and the Sabbath on Saturday instead of Sunday? When did those traditions evolve and change?
I would argue there's evidence in the book of Acts, and especially in chapter 21. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about this tomorrow, but I would argue that in Acts 15 and Acts 21, there's clear evidence that the Jewish Christians did continue to keep kosher and so forth. The Gentiles Christians did not, because the Gentiles were never intended by the rabbis to keep kosher and follow Torah in the same way. I'm starting back.
Are we not on that kind of slippery slope though, where we say they had it wrong for thousands of years, but now we have it right?
Well, as I'll explain tomorrow in the history of Christian Zionism, that some Christians had it right for 2,000. There's a continual stream of Christian Zionism for 2,000 years. So it's not that we had it all wrong. But of course, most of you are Protestants. And most Protestants believe that the church really went off the rails pretty early on, and it wasn't until Martin Luther and John Calvin that the church got back on the rails. So Protestants are used to thinking that it doesn't matter that there were, 1,500 years of mistakes, and now we're here to correct it and protest as Protestants. Now, I didn't say that was right.
Last question, word, then we'll take a break.
Just worrying about Marcion. We know that he rejected the Older Testament here in the first half of the 2nd century, and yet he, in 144, he's called a heretic. And you completely reject Marcionism, and then through the back door, we are resurrecting Marcionism and practicing neo-Marcionism today. How is that we're rejected in one way and then accepted in another way?
I'll repeat the question, since probably some of you didn't hear it. Why is it that Marcion is condemned as a heretic mid-2nd century? Marcion was the quasi-Gnostic who said that the Jewish God was an evil God, since he talked about matter and created matter. And all the Old Testament is about the Jewish God, therefore it needs to be thrown out. Some of the Gospels need to be thrown out because they're too Jewish, and we really ought to have only the Gospel of Luke, and maybe the Gospel of John, and some of the epistles of Paul, and all the rest of them be thrown out because they're too Jewish about this evil Jewish God. Well, Marcion was condemned by the Church Fathers, but Dr. Young says, how did a kind of Marcionism sneak back in, by the back door? And I would say it's because after 135, it was no longer helpful to be a Jew and a follower of the Jewish Messiah at the same time. You were persecuted throughout the Roman Empire for doing that. And more Gentiles were pouring into the church. They were not taught the Jewish background. More and more leaders of the church were Gentile with very little knowledge of the Jewish background. And so it was largely out of ignorance. And then they became competitors. The synagogue and the church became competitors for new members. And competition, that kind of religious competition can produce a lot of enmity.